Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Removing Biases from Critical Decisions in Your Organizations. My name is Ted Dacko, and I will serve as your host today. We are really looking forward to sharing some of our tips and techniques today regarding how to remove these critical biases from your critical decision-making process. And candidly, this is a topic that saves organizations millions of dollars, so it's well worth putting some thought into. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. All of you are in listen-only mode to keep the background noise at a minimum. We do want to take questions at the end. There is a dialog box on the right-hand side, and there's a question section, and you could key your questions in there. And at the end, we will take some questions. If we don't get to yours, we'll be back to you individually. We want this to be interactive, so we're going to be offering a few polls in our webinar today. We ask you to respond to those polls. After the webinar, we will send you the slide presentation, and a recorded version of this will be available for you, and then also contact information in case you have any questions or comments or anything that you want us to follow up with. We'd be happy to do that. Our agenda today is focused on giving you those tips and tactics that we talked about earlier that you can walk away with and apply to your own situation. We're going to talk about what decisions are of consequence, 12 biases that impact these decisions, a 5-step process to simplify complexity of big decisions. We're going to take your questions and answers, and then we'll provide some next steps. Sharif, did I get that right?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Ted.
All right, great. Then without further ado, I'm happy to introduce you to our special guest and decision expert, Sharif Fargal. Sharif, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning more about these decision biases and why in the heck it's bigger deal than we've previously thought. For those of you on the phone, Sharif is the CEO of Alivance and founder of Pyramid Consulting International. His work in removing decision biases spans more than 25 years and is truly fascinating. So, Sharif, to kick things off, maybe you could share with us why this is a passion of yours and what inspired your work here.
So a long time ago, about 22 years ago, I was doing my PhD at the University of Michigan. And one of the things that I was working on is decision modeling and decision making. And it was very surprising to me that I found a lot of the decision models avoid having subjective criteria included there because they weren't able to measure it. So I was reading a book by Thomas Sadi. He is a business professor at Wharton at that time. And one sentence particularly grabbed my attention, which was, objectivity is nothing more than shared subjectivity. Think about that. Objectivity is nothing more than shared subjectivity. Isn't that the simple truth? So, for example, we all agree that 1 foot is 12 inches, right? Mm-hmm. So why do we agree on that? Because some people a long time ago decided that that's the case. So if they had agreed at that time that 1 foot is 24 inches, I would have been 3 feet tall instead of 6 feet tall right now. So that made me think a lot about this. If we agree on something, right, then it can become a measure. Then we can use it to measure things. So this prompted me to study and research, and ultimately I did my dissertation on how to make the subjective objective. After that, I started working with consulting companies. I worked with Deloitte for a few years, and then I started my own practice, which is Pyramid Consulting International, in 2007. Now, I've spent more than 25 years working with large organizations on how to make decisions aligned with strategic priorities, and specifically, how to measure objectivity. So this is really a true passion of mine, to start including subjective criteria into the decision-making process.
Now, a lot of people will just accept that subjectivity can't be measured, but I think what I hear you saying is that it can be. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Let's start by first saying what cannot be measured. So intuition, you cannot measure, right? It's gut feeling. It's based on experience. But everything else, in my opinion, can be measured. So let me give you an example about subjective versus objective criteria. If you're buying a car and you're looking at the price of the car as one of the criteria that you're using, you know for sure that $20,000 is more expensive than $10,000, right? Mm-hmm. We all agree that 20 is bigger than 10, so that can be quantitative. But when you're looking at the style of the car, if you like nice, cool cars, if you like certain colors, if you like that, what's the measure for that? Can we say blue is scoring higher than red, for example? We cannot say that, right? Because there's no measure to define that. However, if we are the decision makers and we agree that blue is better than red, in our opinion, then every car that is blue will score higher than red. So this is how we can translate subjectivity into objectivity. So if you agree on a certain set of preferences, then you can measure and score.
So by removing subjectivity, does the method that you're going to describe today eliminate biases in decision making?
Well, as long as humans make decisions, there will always be bias, right? Because even if we introduce the most sophisticated, structured approaches for decision making, in the end, humans will be making the decisions. And as long as humans make those decisions, bias will always be there. So we're not going to completely eliminate bias, but what we can do is try to minimize bias as much as possible. So two things I have learned working with clients for more than 20 years. Biases do impact decisions. And there are two things that we can do to minimize those biases. Number one, bias awareness. If you're aware of the biases, then you will be able to recognize immediately that you're falling into that trap, and then you can avoid it. Number two is introducing discipline in the decision-making process. Introducing discipline in your decision-making process will help you uncover errors in thinking before they become errors in judgment. So you will realize immediately, are you on the right track before making the decisions? So today, I want to share with you some of the lessons that I learned that led me to develop the method that we're going to talk about later.
So Sharif, the audience members, I'm sure, are very, very curious about what kind of decisions we're talking about here. So what are these decisions that we can impact?
So we all make decisions all the time, either personal or in business. What surprised me most is that while it's okay to make decisions based on gut feelings on a personal level. So if you're deciding which restaurants you want to go for dinner and you make the wrong decision, how much did you lose? You lose like, $20, $30. But what surprised me was that organizations also go over their guts when they're making decisions. That means that hundreds of millions of dollars are in jeopardy here because of that. So the decisions that I'm going to talk about are personal. These are decisions that I personally work with clients on. And I can categorize those into three categories. One is capital allocation. Number two, resource allocation. Number three, time allocation. And one of the decisions that I work with a lot of clients on is capital project prioritization. It's like you have a budget. No company in the world have enough money to be able to do all the projects that they want to do. So how do you prioritize the projects that you have to make sure that you're selecting the best projects? So capital project prioritization, I worked a lot on that. Deferred maintenance prioritization for hospitals. Hospitals have a huge backlog with deferred maintenance projects. They never have enough money to do that. I worked a lot with corporate budgeting, software selection, some cases. From a resource allocation, I worked with a lot of automotive suppliers in selecting what tier 2 suppliers they want to work with. And believe me, this decision is very important because they have hundreds and hundreds of suppliers, and it's very important to choose the right supplier to work with. From a time allocation, I worked in task planning with some organization, how to distribute time across tasks, and product feature prioritization. So these are all decisions that I personally work on, but as you know, Ted, there's a lot of other decisions that also can use a structure.
So let's get some audience participation here. Let's start with our first polling question. Which category of decisions that Sharif just talked about are you involved with in your organization? So we're going to give you a couple of these choices, and please select one. Still got some votes coming in. Please participate, folks. See the votes coming in. Okay, let's close the poll. And let's show the audience the results.
Yeah, so most audience show that, you know, they work on capital and resource allocation, less working on time allocation. So based on that, I think this webinar can be of great value to you.
Well, nobody answered none, so we have the right people on the phone.
Yes, I agree.
So Sharif, we talked about what decisions, and now let's dig into what these 12 biases are. And so tell me a little bit about the biases.
So, of course, there's more than 12 biases, right, out there. But what I try to do here is try to collect the most common 12 biases. There's a lot of research that's been done recently and actually a long time ago about human biases and cognitive research and all that. So what I'm trying to do here is not tell you about all the biases that exist out there, but some of the most important ones that you might recognize. What I'm going to do now for each one of those biases, I'm going to just define what the bias is, and then talk maybe a very small example about what this bias is about, and then maybe give you a couple of tips about how to avoid those biases before start talking about a structured process to systematically eliminate those biases. So bias number one would be the anchoring bias. So what we see or hear first feels most important. It leads us also to give disproportionate weight to the first piece of information we receive. So let's say that you're negotiating to buy a car, and the car salesman says, this car is $40,000, right? The first thing that you're going to do is say, well, no, how about 37, right? But what if the salesman has said it's $20,000? Would you still have said 37? Probably would have said something about 17 or 18. So that means that because he anchored you already to that number, 40,000, that's what you use to use this negotiation about. So that's anchoring. So what can we do? Anchors come in many forms. It can be a comment from a colleague. It can be a statistic that we read in a report, a past event or trend. To be able to minimize the impact of this, number one, think about the problem on your own before start consulting other people, right? Number two, pursue other lines of thought. Seek information and opinions from a variety of people to widen your frame of reference. And also, avoid anchoring people. So when soliciting advice from others, try to listen first before sharing your own ideas so that you can avoid anchoring them. Number two is the status quo, and it's basically that we prefer things to stay the same. We tend to maintain the current situation, even when better alternatives exist. This is very common bias. Anyone who's worked in departmental budgeting know that, because if we gave that department that amount of money last year, let's just give them the same amount of money this year, right? So everybody should be familiar with that bias. It's a very common bias. Now, why do we do that? We do that because we feel that it's easier this way, right? So, and I don't want to say that you always have to change the status quo. Maintaining the status quo may indeed be the best option, but you don't want to choose that option just because it's comfortable. So how do we try to avoid this bias? Number one, you have to ask if the status quo really serves your objectives, okay? You have to ask that every year when you're doing your budgeting. Number two, you have to evaluate carefully pros and cons of a lot of alternatives. Never think that the status quo is the only alternative that you have. And number three, which is very important in my opinion, is avoid exaggerating the effort or cost involved in switching from the status quo. The third bias that I want to talk about is the sunk cost, which basically means that we make decisions that justify past choices. Basically, we do this because we're afraid to admit that we took the wrong path in the first place, and we may naively be hoping to recoup our losses. You started a project, you dumped a lot of money on that project, that project is not going very well, you still keep dumping money into that project hoping that it's going to be all right, right? So one of the interesting examples of this, when I look at banks, right, there's a lot of research out there about loans, and one of the interesting reads that I read is that loan officers who gave a bad loan, they keep dumping money into that loan all the time, hoping that it will turn around. But when new loan officers take that loan, they immediately terminate that loan because they're not biased. They're not the ones who made that loan. So the golden rule here is when you find yourself in a hole, the best thing you can do is stop digging. Now, how do you avoid that bias? You avoid it by asking input from people who were not involved in the original decision. Remind yourself always that even the best people make mistakes, right? It's okay to make a mistake, but once you find out, you stop. The fourth bias that I want to talk about is what we call confirming evidence or confirmation bias, and I did that many times in my life, and I'm sure, Ted, you've done it too, and a lot of the participants as well, is that we seek information that supports our existing point of view.
Just look at Facebook.
Just look at Facebook. I don't have a Facebook account, by the way, so but we do that all the time, right? We always seek information that supports what we already think. I was working with a CEO of a utility company one time, and he wants to cancel a plant expansion. There was a proposed plant expansion that he wanted to cancel, and even though I think a lot of the staff, a lot of the managers, the plant manager, a lot of the people there were supporting that plant extension, but the CEO did not want to do that plant extension. So what did he do? He called a friend of his who was a plant manager in another company talking about the same type of project, and she told him that she actually did not do that plant expansion on her own because it doesn't seem to her like a good idea. So he confirmed what he already thinks. He only called the person that has done the same thing that he's thinking. So then he canceled the plant expansion, which was not a good decision in the end. So how do you want to do that? How do you want to prevent yourself from falling into that trap? Number one, examine all evidence with equal rigor, right? So you have to ask a respected colleague to argue against your potential decisions or come up with counter argument, and don't choose people who are likely to agree with you. Try to open yourself up to different opinions and all that. Number five, framing. Framing is that the way we state our problem influences what we decide, right? And most people fall into that trap because they frame the problem by being like either a gain or a loss, okay? Nothing is just completely a gain or completely a loss. Every alternative has its pros and cons, and that's what we need to be looking on. And framing the problem, imagine if I come to you and I'm the boss, and I'm coming to two of my departments, and I say, you know, I will be able to save this department this year. We have enough money to save this department. Or I can frame the problem by saying, we don't have enough money this year. We have to cancel that department. It's the same thing, because one department is going to be saved, the other one's going to be canceled. But the way I frame the problem, whether it's positive or negative, impacts the way people receive this decision a lot. So you can limit the adverse effects of framing by taking some precautions. Number one, don't automatically accept the initial frame. So always try to view the problem in various ways. Number two, you have to pose the problems neutrally. It's not as gains or losses, right? So you have to pose the problems like what kind of impact each one of those alternatives do, and then try suggesting different frames. That will help you avoid cornering yourself into the original frame. Now, next, I want to talk about three biases, but I combine them all in one bias, which is under the title Estimating and Forecasting. Number one is overconfidence. Overconfidence in our estimates, meaning like we put so much trust in the accuracy of our forecasts. We think that our forecasts are solid, that they cannot be wrong, right? And if you just work in any organization, consider the amount of money wasted on ill-fated projects just because we think that we have done the right estimates, right? and we refuse to revise our estimates even if the market or even if the circumstances change and show us that this is not a good product or not a good project, right? So to reduce the effect of that, instead of just being so confident in your estimate, try to put a range. Start considering the lowest and highest possible values, right? Basically, avoid being anchored by your initial estimate, right? We talked about anchoring before. So just try to avoid being anchored by your initial estimate. And then challenge team members' estimates in similar fashion, right, when you get an estimate. The second bias underestimating and forecasting is prudence. Actually, basically, it's the opposite of overconfidence, right? We are not sure at all of our estimates that we try to pad them. So anyone who worked with engineering, when engineering, they do estimating, right? When do estimates, they are not confident. They are not confident that they've seen all the elements of the estimate. So what they do, they pad the estimate. They make it so big, right? So what happens when you do this? You find out that the actual cost of projects come out much less than the estimate, and you leave a lot of money on the table just because you padded your estimates because you're not sure whether you're doing them right or wrong. So to avoid this prudence trap, the only thing you need to do is just state your estimates honestly, right? Don't pad your estimates. You have to estimate them honestly and ask the same of others who will be supplying you with estimates. The final one that I want to talk under estimating and forecasting is recallability. So it prompts us to give undue weight to recent dramatic events. I mean, we all exaggerate the probability of rare catastrophes, such as, for example, plane crashes, just because they got disproportionate attention in the media, right? So you have one event like this, and it will cause you to make errors in estimating just because you're worried so much about something that's really rare. So to be able to avoid this, try to make sure that your assumptions are not unduly influenced by your memory. So question everything you think you know. And check your impressions against facts and figures, right? Don't be overly worried about something that's rare. Then the second set of biases from 7 to 12, these are things that everybody experiences on a daily basis. Priming involves being influenced by information received right before making decisions. You're going into a meeting, someone meets you at the door and say, hey, remember this. That thing that they just told you would be the first thing on your mind when you're making your decision. So try to avoid that priming bias by don't base your decision based on just one piece of information, but rather base it on the impact on all priorities. Just try to measure the impact of your alternatives on all your priorities. Number 2, project influence, which is like focusing on the what, not the why. How many times we gather around the room and there's a project that looks very desirable to us, and we say, let's do this project, but we're not thinking about why are we doing this project, right? This is this trap here. This bias is the project influence. So try to, when you select something, and we'll talk about this in the end, is try to select everything based on strategic alignment, right? Not on project that seems desirable. Politics, and I don't know what else to call it, so I called it politics. It's like, we make decisions, the decision is always skewed towards the most influential person in the room. And one thing I'm going to tell you, don't make your decisions in the room. just go outside. Don't make your decision based on influence. I mean, your boss is sitting there. He or she is saying something, and you tend to agree with them because they're your boss, right? And you have to make up some decision. Don't do that. Just take the information, go out, follow a structured process, and make your decision. The personal influence, just like the project influence was focused on the what and not the why, the personal influence bias is about the who and not the why, right? If I'm responsible for distributing money in my organization, I might give money to some person because I like that person, not because the projects that he or she is bringing are the best projects that we need to do. So this bias is very clear, it's very simple, and again, following a structured process will help you eliminate this. Dominant criterion. So if I ask you, where do you want to go to dinner today? Ted, what would you say if I ask you, where do you want to go to dinner today?
I want to go to the West End Grill.
Well,
are you paying?
So you want to go to the West End Grill. Now, it's impossible that you've made that decision in 1 second, right? So what did you think about when you actually made that decision? A certain plate that you ate there before, it was nice?
Yes.
Exactly. Now, did you consider the price of that plate?
Sort of.
You could not have considered this in 1 second.
No.
Did you consider the quality of the service? I could never find parking at the West End Grill, right? So Ted just made a decision very quickly just because there's one dominant criterion that he thought of, which is the one particular plate that he liked so much at that restaurant, right? So but what would be the cost of that price? It would be the cost of that decision would be like what, $40, maybe $50. West End Grill is a little expensive. Yeah, about $100. Yeah, but imagine if organizations are making decisions based on that. They have one criterion that they use to make these decisions, how much the cost will be. The last one is called thin slicing. Thin slicing is about how fast you make the decision. People sometimes, like what Ted just did, people make snap judgments right away based on first impressions. What we're trying to say here is, you know, give yourself a little bit of time to make these decisions. And by the way, going back to the dominant criterion, there's something that I want to mention before actually moving on. A famous psychologist named George Miller, a long time ago, tried to understand how much the mind, the human mind can handle at the same time, right? And guess what that number is?
I'm going to guess 7.
Yes. So it's 7 plus or minus 2, right? And that's a lot, seems a lot, but actually the human mind can actually hold and can manage, can hold 7 plus or minus 2 things in the active memory. So don't underestimate your human mind and your human brain. So you can think of a lot of things at the same time. You don't have to do that. And then going back again, talking about thin slicing, we talk about how fast you make decisions. Just try to take your time, go through a structured process, and hopefully you'll be able to make the right decision.
Now, these biases are available on the Alavance Method website. You can,
yes.
So people could look there and see them.
Absolutely.
You're going to get a copy of these slides, but if you want to get a quick look, they are available on the alavancemethod.com website. So let's do our second poll of the day. How many of these biases do you experience in your organization? We're giving you a range of choices that you can choose from, so not thin slicing here, so take your time and think about it. 0, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, or 9 to 12. And we have some votes coming in. We're watching them come in. A couple of more seconds. If you want to vote, please do so.
I'm watching people who will say 0, but none so far.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what the poll results look like.
Yeah, so actually it's interesting. There's 43% of the audience said that they experienced 9 to 12, like experience all of the biases, right? And around 50% said they experience 50% of the biases. 0% said they don't experience any biases. So again, Ted, using your word, I think you're definitely on the right webinar.
There you go. All right. So let's move from the biases to some of the goals. Sharif, what are the goals that you wanted to achieve when you developed your process?
So when I was working with a lot of organizations, I find that a lot of organizations lack structured decision-making process, right? So what I tried to do is I tried to look at these decision-making processes, and I tried to unpack a very complex decision and make it simple, right? I wanted to ensure, and it's very important, that our decisions align with strategic objectives and priorities, right? So really, before I even talk about this, I want to ask a question, and this question I get asked all the time, right? How do you know that your method is going to lead to the right decision, right? And when someone asks me that question, I ask them right back at them. I say, what do you mean the right decision? Because if there's only one right decision, we're all going to be wearing the same clothes. We're all going to be driving the same car. But the fact that we're all wearing different clothes and driving different cars, that means that everyone has made what they think is the right decision for them. My definition of the right decision is very simple. It's decision that most align with your priorities, right? The problem is that it's always not very visible or not very clear to be able to see am I making the decision that's aligning with my priorities? So what I try to do when I developed this process, right, is I looked at what are the decision making processes in organization right now, and I found them to be unstructured, biased. It's like a dartboard. You do some projects and you hope that it's going to be okay. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was a client of mine at one point, and he told me that 3 years ago they just embarked on this program where they spend hundreds of millions of dollars. It's true. This is real numbers. Hundreds of millions of dollars in projects to improve performance in their organizations. 3 years later, these projects are now completed, and supposedly they should have seen a burst in performance. But he told me that he's very disappointed because he wishes he could have selected other projects. The projects that they selected were not the right projects for them. Now, the problem is that they could not see that except after 3 years, right, after these projects are completed. So that's the problem. So what I try to do here is try to develop a method that's programmatic, unbiased, and focus on strategic alignment and also objective, right? That we call the Elevance method. Why are we calling it the Elevance method? Because it comes from two words, allocate and advance, which means make the decision and move on, because you're not going to regret that decision, and because you've taken consideration of all the factors, you've thought about everything, you've done the right things. So that was what's in my mind when I tried to develop this process.
All right. Can you introduce us to the process and the 5 steps?
Yes. So there's 5 steps to the process, and these steps everyone should go through when they make any decision. But unfortunately, like Ted made just the dinner decision very quickly, they don't, right? So I try to unpack that decision-making process. So number 1, strategize, meaning like what are your strategic priority? What's important to you? Number 2, compare, meaning like which one of those strategic priorities is more important than the others, meaning like what are the relative weights across those priorities. So number 1, you have to come up with what's important to you. Number 2, you have to look at those priorities and understand the relative weights between them. Number 3, you have to develop objective scales to be able to measure those priorities and also score projects against those priorities, right? Number 4, score the projects. What are all your alternatives? Look at all your alternatives and try to score them against those priorities. And number 5, make the right selection. Make the selection that will make you most aligned with your priorities. I tried, when developing this process, I tried to make it scientific. I tried to make it as simple as possible, because these are very complex decisions. So I tried to include a lot of elements in the process that will make it manageable. It's very structured. It tried to eliminate as much as possible, as we said, human biases, right? It's tried to develop, and we'll talk about decision coach community later, but we try to develop experts within each organization to help these organization decisions. And analogous to that is like the black belts, right? Every organization have a bunch of black belts now that help them with processes and stuff like that. We're trying to create the same thing within decisions. We call decision coaches and decision coach communities, right? And also, these decisions will be justified and quantified. So these are the steps: strategize, compare, quantify, score, and select.
Okay, before we move to the next section, which is another interactive poll, I want to remind you to ask questions by asking them on the dialog box on the right-hand side. So if you have questions, we're going to take some time at the end. The next interactive poll we have is, do you have a structured decision-making process in your organization? So it's a yes, no, and I'm not sure answer. This should be an easy one. And we have votes coming in. We'll wait a couple of more seconds here. 2 more seconds. All right, let's close the poll and look at the results.
So the results are very expected. It looks exactly like a bell curve, where like the majority of the people, about 60% of the people, said that they don't have a structured decision-making process. There's a few people, about 15% said yes, they do have structured decision, and then about 30% said that they're not sure. Well, so that's about what's expected.
If you're not sure, that's Almost
That's probably no.
That's probably a no answer.
That's probably no.
All right. Let's move on from there. So the process, and I want to talk a little bit about getting into details about the process, but I found it very beneficial for you, Ted, and the audience to understand what is our end goal, right? When we talk about the steps in the process before delving into the detail of each one of those steps. The end goal is strategic alignment, right? The end goal is to be able to make the best decisions. So wouldn't it be nice if you can plot all your alternatives and all your projects on one chart where the y-axis shows the strategic value, the x-axis shows the complexity, and the color shows the urgency when the size of the bubble indicates the project cost? Wouldn't it be nice to have that? Would be.
It would be. But this is a very difficult chart to achieve, right? Why? Because of all the steps that we're going to go through right now. But that, I just wanted to let you know that the end result is to be able to plot these projects like this, which will help you tremendously, select the right projects for you. So, Ted, do you want me to just go ahead and
Absolutely.
start talking about steps? So, step number one is the strategize step, right? So, instead of just trying to explain what this is, I want to go through an example working with a utility company that wanted to prioritize their capital spending, right? This company didn't have money to do all the capital projects that they wanted to do, and they wanted to prioritize the projects to make sure they're selecting the best bang for their buck. So the first thing that I did with them is go through the strategize step, which is step number one. This involved meeting with the strategic team. I met with them with 2 or 3 sessions. We talked about what's important to them. And the 5 things that they came up with after these sessions said safety excellence, operational excellence, environmental stewardship, cost competitiveness, and organizational excellence. Right? Those were the 5 things that they said they were important to them. Then we tried to break it down to strategic objectives. So the picture that you see on the screen here is a strategic value scorecard, where the top line are the strategic priorities, and then everyone is broken down to objectives. What I want to make sure that the audience understand that when you come up with a strategic priority list, it has to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. What does that mean? Mutually exclusive means you have to include everything that's going to get into the decision. And I can't help but give an example here. It's not a business example, it's a personal example. I've been working with a friend of mine that wanted to select between 2 jobs, and we went through the whole process, and in the end, job 1 scored like 60% and job 2 scored 40%. So naturally, he should have selected job 1 because it scored higher. 2 weeks later, I met that guy, and I said, hey, where did you go? He said, well, I selected job number 2. I said, why? I mean, it had the lowest score. He said, yeah, but I had already given my word to the company owner that I'm going to work with him. I told him, remember I told you have to tell me all the criteria. If you had told me that honoring your word to the owner is an important criteria, we would have included it, right? So it's very important that when you think about a set of strategic priorities, think about everything, whether it's objective or subjective or whatever. Think about all the criteria that you have to include to make this decision, right? So that's very important. It has to be collaborative, not just one person in a room coming up with it. It has to be based on discussions. Also, you cannot ignore urgency and complexity, right? Because, like, remember the chart that we talked about, urgency and risk management are very important. Now, when we talk about urgency, how many times, Ted, you've seen people say, oh, this project has to be done by April, it's very important. What's wrong with this statement? What's wrong with this statement is if you have a criticality in timing or urgency, this project becomes very urgent, not necessarily important, right? If the roof is going to fall, that becomes urgent, not important, right? So we have to separate between those 2 things to help the decision makers make better decisions. So this is basically based on a balanced scorecard approach. Meet with the strategic team, you come up with the strategic priorities. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will find that if you do this step right, if you do it collaboratively, if you come up with a mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive list, this step alone can help eliminate or minimize a lot of these biases that we talked about before. Step number 2 is compare. Now, Ted, let me ask you a question. How many times in your professional career you're faced by try to compare, for example, 5 things, right? And what did you do? You create a list. You said, I'll score from 0 to 10. Criteria number 1, I'm going to give it 8.
Yes.
Second one, right? You've done that 100 times, right?
Thousands.
What's wrong with that? That is just number crunching. Why? Because when you're doing comparing things together, it's actually called relative weights, right? We all agree that this is called relative weights. Why is it called relative? Because it's relational. Things are relational to each other. So we are using something called pairwise comparison to compare things together to obtain the relative weights. So if you look at the first comparison here, for example, it's between safety excellence and operational excellence. Remember, those were the first two priorities that we talked about in the previous slide, right? So why is this good? Because it just makes the decision makers or the strategic team focus on just 2 things, right? And think about which one is important to them. The algorithm that is written here takes those comparisons after you finish all the sets of comparisons and immediately provide the relative weights for you, right? But one very important thing that I noticed when I worked with a lot of boards and a lot of strategic teams, they don't think alike. I mean, you would think that people on the same board of any, and Ted, you've been on a few boards, right?
Absolutely.
People on the board, you think that they probably have the same priorities, same way, but what I found out, they don't.
They don't.
Right? So not only that we have a scientific way to come up with the relative weight, but we also can measure the inconsistency, right? How are they, are they thinking alike? Are they thinking the same, right? And we have an algorithm built in here to measure that consistency.
Now, I can't help but notice that you are showing me a software product here. So not only is this a structured process, but it is something that you put into a software.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. Because 20 years ago when I started this, after I finished my PhD, right, I used this method, right, to help a lot of clients. And basically the method was going through these steps, but I have my own spreadsheets, which was pretty ugly, right? And I was so embarrassed to show any of these to my clients, right? But the clients love the methodology. They love the results that are being produced. And every single client, with no fail, asked me, do you have something that you can keep here so that we don't have to hire you every year, Do you have a software or a tool that you can keep here? And I say, no, unfortunately, I don't. So finally, one client was pretty aggressive. He said, you have to develop this thing and because we really need it. So I actually last year started, developing that software, and we launched it on June of 2016, which now, June this year, 2017, which is making it very easier for us to implement this process in organizations.
So I'm sorry I interrupted your flow here, but I just wanted the audience to make sure that they were aware that this is a software product. So the software is new, but the method has been proven for over 25 years.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's right. One final thing that I want to say about this process or this method, it's very dynamic, meaning like if your priorities change, right, and they do all the time, right, the result, the projects that are being selected will be different based on the priorities, right? So it's very dynamic. And it captures all the ever-changing, environment in organizations these days, right? So right now we talked about 2 steps. 1 is come up with the strategic value scorecard, what's important to you. Number 2, use pairwise comparison to compare and obtain relative weights. Number 3 is the quantify. Let me give you an example to simplify this, okay? Let me give you an example to simplify the 3rd step here, which is the quantify step, right? Imagine that you're going, again, I'm going to use the car example. Imagine you're going to buy a car, right? And you see 2 cars that are exactly equal, but one of them is $10,000 and the other one is $20,000, right? And if price is the most important thing to you, right, and the cars being equal otherwise, right, the $10,000 would be more attractive, right?
Yes.
Will it be incredibly more attractive? You don't know, right? Because here's the thing. If all you have in your pocket is $20,000, right, the $10,000 car would be extremely attractive, right? Because you're going to save $10,000, which is half what you own, right?
Yeah.
But if I have $1 million, right, and I'm looking at a 10,000 versus 20,000, right? How attractive that 10,000 difference? It's not that much attractive anymore, right?
Yeah.
So everything is so subjective. Everything is so, nothing is linear, right? Nothing is linear. So in this step here, in the quantify step, we try to develop the scales. And remember, we talked about subjectivity is nothing more than shared, objectivity is nothing more than shared subjectivity. Here's where we try to develop, say, okay, if you look at this criteria, and I want to score projects against this criteria, what's the scale that I have to develop to be able to quantify this criteria and be able to score these projects, right?
Yeah.
So in this case here, we work with the subject matter experts in organizations to come up with all these scales to be able to quantify all these measures and be able to measure against all of these criteria.
Okay. Before we get to the last two criteria, we do want to ask another interactive poll. In your organization, do you have your strategic priorities defined, prioritized, and quantified? And again, we're going to give you a yes, no, and I'm not sure choice. So go ahead and cast your votes.
Wow.
Okay, a couple more seconds. I think we're good. Let's close out the poll and take a look.
So that's interesting because nobody said that they do have their strategic priorities identified and quantified. So we have about 40% says no and 60% says I'm not sure, which, like you said, probably is no. So it's very interesting.
These people need the Alabama method.
Well, I mean, this is some of the results that I noticed with organizations is like the decisions need to be a little bit more structured.
Okay, let's cover the last two.
So the last two steps. So now let's recap really quick. So now we have identified our strategic value scorecard. We compare the priorities. We understand the relative weights. We created the scales. Step number 4 is nothing but, okay, let's just put all the projects and alternatives that we have into the system, right, and try to score them. Now, we create a simple project form, right, that allow the project owner. Who are the project owners? These are the persons, these are the people that will actually sponsor and propose the projects. They are trying to compete for money, and they are proposing these projects. So the project owners are the ones who are going to be able to provide this. One very important thing, Ted, that I think I have to mention right now. One of the biases, I have to say, that I've noticed in a lot of organizations, people who identified strategic priorities and what's important to the company are also the ones making those decisions, which projects to do. What we're trying to do in this process here, which is a very important benefit, is separation between coming up with the strategic priorities and selecting and scoring the projects, right? So while the strategic team is coming up with the strategic priorities, the project owners are the one who are scoring the projects, okay? So this step here is all about scoring the project using a simple project form against all the strategic priorities. The final step now is, again, going back to the chart that I showed you previously, is like the process and the software will produce a bubble chart with all the projects, right? And one of the things that I want you to notice is that chart on the top. I don't know if it's clear to the audience, but that chart on the top is about the strategic alignment. So if you remember, we started with 5 strategic priorities.
That's the one on the left.
That's the one on the left, okay. Yes, top left. So we started with 5 strategic priorities. So this chart here, what it shows is, as I'm selecting the projects, right, what's the strategic impact of each one of those projects on the strategic priorities? So instead of my friend who went through a program for 3 years just to find out after 3 years that the projects were wrong, this will let you know immediately in the beginning, before you even select, whether these projects are likely to positively or negatively impact your priorities, right? So as you can see here, these charts, they tackle the 3 things that we talked about: the strategic value, the complexity, and the urgency. And so one of the things that is very important here is a lot of organizations ask themselves, how much do we really spend on safety? They have no idea, right? Because if you spend, let's say your budget is $100 million, how can you say that $20 million of this are going towards safety? Now, this process here can tell you that, right? Because it takes all the contribution of each one of the projects that you're doing against your strategic priorities. And if safety is one of your strategic priorities, it will tell you how much money you can spend. And I get asked this a lot, and I work with clients a lot. It says, is it better to spend on safety or operational excellence? Because they don't know, right? This process here will also provide some metrics which will say it takes you $2 million to improve safety by 1 point, but it takes you $100,000 to improve operations by 1 point. That means you can see more results quickly in operations versus safety. So all these metrics, right, that have not been available to organizations before are now becoming available using a process like this. So.
All right. I heard you talk a little earlier about a decision coach. What the heck is a decision coach?
A decision coach community is what we're trying to build. And again, I wanted to make an analogy to the black belts, right? A long time ago, the black belts came into organizations with the purpose of improving processes and process improvement, right? What we're trying to build within organizations, a community of decision coaches who are experts in decisions, in making decisions. They are unbiased facilitators, can facilitate the discussions, excellent communicator. And then what we're doing right now is we're trying to develop a program to certify certain users to become decision coaches, right? Our goal is in 5 years from now, organizations have decision coaches built in their organizations, and all the decisions in the organizations are made based on a structured process.
Okay. Tell us about what results you've seen materialize in working with your clients so far.
So a lot of benefits that I got working with the clients so far. Number one, and most important in my mind, is visibility of strategic alignment, right? It's kind of like before I make the decision, I know if this decision is going to be positively or negatively impacting my decision, and that's very important, right? Better collaboration, right? Collaboration. Everybody in the organization feel like they are participating in the process. It simplifies the complexity. There's a lot of complexity in these decisions, and this method simplifies it, and have more confidence and justification in the decisions. These are some of the benefits that I've seen.
Okay, let's look at what questions we might have been asked as part of the audience for some of the remaining time that we have. Thomas wants to know how long would it take to implement a decision process in their organization?
It doesn't take long. Again, we start with the free consultation, and then we come up with a proposal of what they want to do. I would say anything between 1 month to 6 months, depending on how big the organization is and how many decisions they want to make and how many users.
Okay. And Stephanie asks, is Alavance a software company or a consulting company? I'm guessing this is a software company.
Alavance is a software company, but we have also a lot of decision coaches that work with the software company to implement Alavance at organizations. One
last question. James wants to know how much detail is needed on the alternatives in order to compare against the strategic goals.
That's a great question, and not much detail. The project form is customized, right, to include as much detail as you want. The project form will have all the priorities, and I think if I understand the question, how much detail is needed on the alternative, so meaning like the projects or the alternatives, not much detail at all. But like some clients, for example, like what we have so far is like kind of like if you have the alternative name, how much the alternative costs. The project form is very simple after that, and the project owner can just score against all the priorities. But the detail itself is customized. Like I had a client that really wanted the location of the project on the form, right? I have another client that wanted the project manager's name, right? So there's not a lot of detail that is needed to make to make the process work, but it's customizable based on multiple clients.
Okay, in the interest of time, we will stop the questions and we will answer your questions individually if you have asked them and we haven't yet answered them. If we move on from here, there's some resources that we have for you. Please visit our website at www.alavanceMethod.com. Their free consultation, as Sharif mentioned earlier, on improving your decision-making process. You can read our blog posts on decision-making and decision biases. There is some case studies and use cases on the website that will help you understand more about how this can apply to you. The slides and a recorded version of this webinar will be made available to you in the next few days. And with that, we will wish you a pleasant afternoon. And Sharif, I want to thank you for what was a terrific webinar and very informative. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thanks for hosting this, and thank you for having me. I hope that this was beneficial to all of you.
I'm sure it's beneficial to the entire audience. So with that, we'll bid you a pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye now.